Initiate sonic metamorphosis.
Broadcasting from the Millennium Student Center here at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. This is UMSL Student Radio, the U.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and joining me this week, we have Eunice Kahn.
Hello.
Sebastian Forward.
Hello, everybody.
And Becky Hansis-O'Neill.
Hello.
And Dre is not feeling well this week, but we will see her next week. So, lots of great topics we have this week. We're going to talk about space junk. We're going to talk about citizen science and tourism. We're going to talk about, what's the other thing we're going to talk about? The Oceanic Treaty that just happened, real big news with the UN. And we're going to talk about germs for our topic of the show.
Cool.
So, our first topic is all about space junk. This comes to us from Live Science. And space junk, the article, talks all about this debris that's in the atmosphere, which scientists have aptly named space junk. And ultimately, the idea behind this article is that space junk is this pieces of satellite or space equipment that have kind of broken off and not really come back down or been taken out of the atmosphere. So basically, there's just sort of a bunch of space garbage flying around the planet. What are you going to say, Eunice?
So, space junk, as you mentioned, these are basically the debris left over from the satellites that were basically thrown out of the Earth. And some of them, they basically stop working or their mission gets completed, and then they basically sit there. And some of them can remain there in their orbit around the Earth for hundreds of years. So this is a bit of a problem, because if the space debris is there, and humans are sending more and more satellites to space, and then they keep colliding with each other, creating more junk and stuff, then there will be a point where the space will be basically saturated, and the probability of collisions will become high. So although, like right now, it's not a big problem, but this can become a very big problem in the years to come, because companies like SpaceX and Amazon and NASA and ESA, they're planning to send like not hundreds but thousands of satellites into space in the coming decades. So now scientists have started to think about like what can be some ways of getting rid of space junk and stuff like that. And is there any way that we can monitor and the space junk so that like the International Space Station and the other satellites, they can basically move around the space junk so that to avoid any kind of problem or any kind of collisions.
I'll say this leads into something called a Kessler cascade, which I believe is probably the scariest thing that you may or may not have ever heard about. This is the phenomenon wherein, say two dead satellites are floating around in orbit, and they just happen, by chance of their orbits, to smash into each other and explode into, thousands of other tiny little pieces. And if you end up particularly unlucky, those pieces could go hit another satellite and kind of cause this chain reaction wherein you could have entire regions of space around Earth that are totally uninhabitable, totally useless as far as satellite technology goes. It really, the worry is that you could kind of end up with a satellite apocalypse where all of this technology that we've developed would become useless over, a single generation, something like that.
Yeah, the thing I thought was kind of scary in the article is that they mention how some of the debris can just kind of fall back to Earth. And they say, for the most part, don't worry, most of it will burn up in the atmosphere. But occasionally, a piece of a satellite or a spaceship will just land in the middle of God knows where, and it's kind of scary. It's like the sky is falling, like Chicken Little.
Yeah, the sheep farm in Australia was a pretty good example, I thought, in the article.
True.
I also wonder if there's things up there that, and this will sound a little conspiracy theory-ish, but we know that there's lots of intelligence satellites and things like that, and there might be more junk up there than scientists actually know about.
That is fair. I know a lot of the problems with space junk are actually caused by governments blowing up their own satellites or testing out military tech in the, orbital rings where satellites commonly happen. So that's one of the biggest problems, and there's a bunch of all of the global space agencies are trying to make regulations, but it's really hard because nobody actually owns space, so nobody's actually in charge of space laws. So it's not something that you can tell a foreign government that they can't do, legally. It's pretty much a new field for law, and something that the people who are getting more and more worried about this are trying to solve.
That's very true. And we will be talking about the Oceanic Treaty in a bit. And it kind of reminds me that we need similar treaties like for space as well. The audience might remember, we were talking about basically bombarding the lunar surface and then using the lunar soil to deflect some of the sunlight to avoid the Earth getting warmed up. But again, if there are no laws, or the laws are so limited, or they're up for interpretation, then that can create a lot of problems, because who gets to decide basically the world powers? And usually in matters like these, the poor countries, they suffer the most. One big example is the carbon dioxide emission. The big countries, the world powers, they basically emit 40 to 50% of it. And the smaller nations, they basically emit 1 to 2% combined. But floods and famines and droughts and all the things, the poor countries suffer most from it. So I totally agree with Sebastian that there should be laws, not just for the oceanic treaties, which we'll be discussing in a bit, but also for space-related things.
It seems like those are often very difficult to enforce, and we'll talk about this when we get to the ocean topic as well. But I thought about this when the International Space Station arm was damaged, a piece of space junk hit it. If they could find the owner of the junk, I don't think there's a legal way to make them say, pay to fix the arm. I think that's a lot easier said than done.
There's also a big issue. Any time you put something in orbit, it's going to come down again. It's going to re-enter. And fortunately, that's actually a good thing. I know, Jeremy, you said earlier about the worrying about things falling out of orbit. In the space junk problem, that's actually the good thing. We want them to fall out of orbit so that they quit flying around in space and threatening the other satellites. And that actually brings me to something that's brought up often in this discussion, is kind of like the SpaceX constellations for satellite internet. And fortunately, those are not a big risk for what we're talking about here. It might sound like it because they're intending to put thousands of satellites in orbit, but they are putting them in low Earth orbit, an orbit so low that they're going to naturally fall out within a couple years. So if you had this Kessler cascade and say all of them blew up and turned into shrapnel, it would fall out of orbit in a couple years, which is all right. Further out from Earth, you get into things that are thousands of year orbits, meaning if those satellites ended up colliding, you could have a basically shrapnel storm of bullets for thousands or tens of thousands of years, which is more scary.
And speaking of collisions, it might sound as if they might not cause a lot of problem or a lot of damage, because most of these space junk, they consist of very tiny millimeter or centimeter sized bodies, although some of them are full size satellites and stuff. But just for example, in 2016, one of this space object, which was basically a few centimeters long, or maybe smaller than that, it hit one of the windows on the International Space Station. And it basically cracked the window, and it caused a quarter of an inch dent in the window. So the impact can be huge because of the fact that the space junk is basically flying around at a speed of around 30,000 kilometers per hour or something more than that.
The thing for me that also seemed very important to discuss is that the space junk flying around, while yes, we want it to come down, it also is like damaging equipment of other astronauts and other space explorers who are also doing research. So it seems funny to me that the debris left over from previous research is now damaging future research. I thought that was just kind of ironic. But yeah, any other thoughts on space junk? Alrighty, let's get to our next article. And as everyone alluded to earlier, that is all about the Ocean Treaty. So this comes to us from BBC News, and the article title is Ocean Treaty, Historic Agreement Reached After Decades of Talks. Or Decade of Talks, excuse me, just one decade. So ultimately, the article talks about how the United Nations have come to this historic agreement to protect the world's oceans after what has been 10 years of negotiations. So there's a lot of talks, a lot of time, a lot of discourse around this topic. But ultimately, they have settled on what is called the High Seas Treaty, and that is going to help place roughly 30% of the ocean in what is deemed protected areas by the year 2030. So about 7 years from now, they hope to achieve this goal. And ultimately, this is to safeguard and help all the marine life recuperate from any past damages. So that's a long time to debate over protecting water.
That is true. And I think this is what I was thinking about, like, right when you were talking about it. And I will quote something from this article. It says, richer nations currently have the resources and funding to explore the deep ocean, but poorer nations wanted to ensure any benefits they find are shared equally. So I think that's a legit point, and it's kind of disappointing that still it took like 1 decade of negotiations to reach this agreement, because the smaller nations, whatever they were demanding, it was kind of obvious and it was kind of reasonable and plausible. What do you think, Sebastian?
I think for some of these, a good chunk of this program looked to me kind of like dividing up resources. Like part of it's conservation, and a surprisingly large piece of it was basically dividing up how nations kind of split the profits from things that are obtained from, high seas, international waters research. And I thought that it was kind of interesting that so much of this debate was about that, when there's not that much like economic things. Apparently there's only one product out there that's like a pharmaceutical, or I believe it was like a skin product derived from like international waters research. So it seemed like they were kind of fighting over this resource that might not actually be that significant in the broader scheme of things.
I thought this was interesting because it rang a bell in my head for something I had remembered. Recently, a famous marine biologist, Sylvia Earle, passed away. I think it was last year. And she had a nonprofit called Mission Blue, and Mission Blue had been trying to make hope spots, which the goal was to make enough hope spots conservation areas to protect 30% of the ocean. So I wondered if this stemmed from some of Mission Blue's work, and I felt a little bummed that Sylvia Earle wasn't around to get to see it actually happen.
Yeah, it is actually kind of depressing that her life's work kind of went unseen by her. She didn't get to reach that point. One thing I thought interesting in the article is that what Sebastian alluded to earlier about basically discourse over resources is that they refer to all the plants and animals and all like the stuff in the ocean as genetic resources, which I thought was an interesting word to choose, because it's not really what they're doing with it. They're not really doing any sort of DNA analysis, or they're not using it for DNA or genetic purposes. They're using it for, like we mentioned, like products and products that would go towards services and that type of thing. So I thought that was a curious choice of words for the council.
I think a lot, most of the industry that's kind of a problem, or that they're like looking to regulate, is mining, or deep sea mining, which is kind of an emerging field that I won't really talk about too much, but it's something people are trying to get ahead of regulating so that it doesn't become a huge problem in the future. and then fishing, which is kind of like a global problem of overfishing and whatnot. But this kind of genetic resources thing is a new struggle in the world of science, of like, if you collect the genome of something, it's genetic information. Do you own that? What can you do with it? Like, who is responsible for figuring that out? And I think it's kind of a small part of the research that's turned into a big part of the laws and the news, just because it's really new, and it's not really something that there are laws about already. So I think that's why there's an emphasis on this.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit strange as well, because they mention explicitly that from the IUCN Ocean team, as they're talking about these intellectual rights to the genetic information, when I would have approached it more from, gee, we better sequence everything before human activity kills it. So, yeah, I was also a little surprised to read that.
Yeah. So just a bit about the treaty, like how it will be implemented. So the High Seas Treaty, it establishes marine protected areas in the high seas, and basically it is aimed at protecting at least 30% of the high seas by the like in the coming decade. And I think it's a good initiative. So according to this, there will be limit on fishing that can take place, and the routes of shipping lanes and exploration activities like deep sea mining, they will be reassessed and they will be kind of adjusted, so that to save the habitat and the activities of the deep sea animals and the plants. So that's how it will be implemented.
I think it's a wonderful idea, but I have some concerns about the economics of implementing it, because this is going to be much easier for larger countries with more economic resources or have a coast guard to be able to actually patrol and protect these areas. Countries that don't have those resources are going to have a much harder time. And biodiversity doesn't only exist on the coasts and under the protection of wealthy nations. So I'm really curious how they will essentially address that moving forward.
I'll say it's also going to be a problem with international enforcement, just dealing with, countries that are simply large and powerful enough to ignore the laws. Like, the big one in oceanic stuff is China, whose, like, international fleets are kind of known for just ignoring the law a lot of time in terms of fishing, overfishing, and that kind of regulations. So, if you're big enough and if you have the protection of a large enough country, it doesn't mean you have to follow the, like, charter of the UN if you were basically a nationally subsidized fleet. So I think that's one of the biggest problems with this, is just, players that are big enough to ignore the rules.
You don't even have to be a big player, because it's so difficult to actually, A, get evidence that a ship is violating the law, and then figuring out where to try it. Because once a ship is caught fishing somewhere they're not supposed to, they can change the flag they fly under. So if it was a Chinese ship yesterday, it could become an Indonesian ship tomorrow. So it's very hard to enforce these laws, or these agreements, I guess I should call them. Laws is a bit much.
Yeah, they're not laws yet, and unfortunately, a lot of the United Nations thing, the country itself has to, like, accept and legally acknowledge that it is now a law. So if your country just doesn't, like, ratify this law, that means that it's not a law in, wherever you are. That's a problem with a lot of these international agreements, is if you have an explicitly, like, opposing government, or if your country just doesn't want to follow those laws, you can't always get them to.
So despite all the complications that we've clearly identified with this, does this treaty make you hopeful about the future of the oceans and marine life and protecting that?
Yeah, it actually does. I'm excited to see it. And I hope that there's provisions in there to actually give different governments that want to enforce these laws the resources they need to do it.
International agreements are always a good start to solving the problem. They are never the answer to the problem, and they're never really, like, the solution. They're always, like, a good place to begin figuring out the rest of the problem.
That's very true. And I was amazed by like how many species do we have in the high seas especially. So according to the article, there are like 230,000 species in the ocean which have been recorded. But there are over 2 million estimated species that exist in the high waters. So that is kind of interesting as well, because like the more we take part in these activities and these treaties, actually, we will be able to save more marine organisms and animals and plants' life, basically, and scientists can study it later. So it's like not only good for the preservation, but also for like the long-term discovery of life in those high waters.
Cool. All right, segueing kind of nicely into our last article for the news section, is this comes to us from Smithsonian Magazine, and this article is titled "How Vacationers on Antarctic Cruises Are Filling in Scientific Gaps." So the crux of the article is basically this: scientists in Antarctica, that was a mouthful, have access to submarines and can go deep beneath the ocean and look for different organisms and document them. At the same time, however, there are lots of cruises going on in the area with many tourists who are also interested in looking and seeing and finding unique animals. The author of the article basically poses this sort of dilemma that the tourists are able to find and sea organisms. The big one they cite in this article is the phantom jellyfish, which is an awesome name for an organism. It's basically this sort of giant jellyfish that doesn't come up from the ocean floor or the deeper part of the ocean very often, but tourists are able to find it as part of their sightseeing cruise. And the author is kind of posing this question of, as cool as it is that we have these tourists seeing these things and documenting these things, which they can provide, photos or evidence of science, because these phantom jellyfish, like the name suggests, are not seen very often. However, the tourists on those cruise ships are also producing a lot of carbon dioxide, adding to global warming. The ecotourism, in that sense, is not necessarily helpful for the environment. So there's this sort of there's conflicting thoughts about this overall. And what are our thoughts on this? About ecotourism and how that can influence biological research.
I think for this article in particular, talking about the Antarctic research, it's really hard to get there, and just logistically, it is a difficult place to do research, and it's very expensive as a scientist to you have to get charter on a ship. You have to get all the resources you need to, if you're on a base there, you have to pay for to get there, the base, all your accommodations. It's very difficult to arrange that just kind of on the base logistic level. And this article talks about how tourists wanting to go, have fun and just sightsee in these areas can actually help fund that by paying some of the overheads on these boats that are going down there, and kind of developing an industry around the tourism gives the scientists something to kind of hitch a ride onto and get there without having to pay for the entire giant ship themselves, which I think it's a pretty cool idea.
Yeah, I thought this article was interesting because it focused on really large cruise ships, but you can pay a lot more money and go on not a citizen science kind of expedition, and I didn't even get the sense the big cruise ships were doing citizen science. But you can pay for a spot on a much smaller vessel, and I suspect that kind of money and that kind of time is more beneficial than getting on a big cruise ship. Even the submersibles that they're...
That is true. My main concern about this would be that, okay, the tourists, they are seeing all these organisms that haven't been seen in a while, or frequently at least. But the question is, do they have the scientific knowledge of the scientific method, or do they have the techniques, or do they have the instruments to study the organisms in a scientifically productive and accurate way? So I would say touting these efforts as very substantial or very a game changer to science, which is evident from some of the wordings or the way they have stated it. I think it's a bit exaggerating, but I totally agree with Sebastian. that incentives should be given to the scientists, or they should be accommodated their instrument and they themselves, so that they can go and they can do proper research using scientific methods and techniques. So that would be more helpful rather than just seeing the organism, taking some pictures of them. Like, it looks cool and everything, and I really like the pictures that I see of these phantom jellyfish, and even the description is just amazing. It's just like a different creature, to me at least. But I would say, like, more serious or more concentrated efforts need to be done in order to explore the marine organisms.
For sure.
I think I don't want to downplay the citizen science here. And I know Becky said the article is kind of using citizen science very loosely. It's just sort of like people happen to be there when some science occurred. But I do think the idea the article gets at having just people out in nature, boots on the ground, is important, because it is important for people to experience nature, but also just by having more people observing it, you're more likely to, by happenstance, see something. Because part of what I read when I read the article is like, well, it kind of just seems like dumb luck. They happen to be there, and there happened to be this thing that happened, but also they happen to be there, and that thing happened to happen, so they're able to document it. So I don't want to necessarily fault the tourists for being tourists. I think it's important that they were there at all and at least documented something, because they could just like, whatever, and like let the giant phantom jellyfish swim away, and then we wouldn't have anything.
Yeah, and if they're uploading that to iNaturalist and even including just a little bit of depth data or what have you, then all scientists can look at that. And we can actually perhaps start to make a little range of phantom jellyfish. So if they're reporting it using a good tool like iNaturalist, I think it can be useful.
For our audience, Becky, what is iNaturalist?
Oh, iNaturalist is a citizen science app. You can download it on your phone. You can upload pictures of anything that you see. You don't even have to know what it is. iNaturalist uses machine learning, but also other experts to identify what's in your photo. It goes to a database that scientists can actually access and use in their own research. So it gets quality checked by other people, and computers are just getting better and better at identifying things without human input at all.
Very cool. Yeah, you should definitely check out iNaturalist. There's lots of scientists who use it, so if you don't know what something is in your backyard or when you're out on a hike, you can totally submit it and you can get answers. All right, that's going to wrap up our news section. We will be right back for the topic of the show, talking about germs. It's about to get very gross.
Initiate sonic metamorphosis.
Broadcasting from the Millennium Student Center here at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. This is UMSL Student Radio, the U.
And we're back. So now it's time for topic of the show. And this week, we're going to talk all about germs. So what prompted this topic in my mind was I found this article on NPR, which I was thinking about sharing for the news, but I think it would make for a much better jumping off point for discussion. So the article from NPR is titled this. It's "A Man Dies of Brain-Eating Amoeba, Possibly from Rinsing His Sinuses with Tap Water." So basically, this guy wanted to flesh out his sinuses, and the water happened to have this very rare amoeba in it, and this amoeba basically went into his brain, infected it, and then killed him. Not a common occurrence, something sort of a freak incident, if you will, but scary nonetheless. And this got me just thinking about, now that we're kind of ending the winter season, which is typically cold and flu season, we interact with germs a lot, and for the most part, we don't have brain, eating amoeba killing us. But it got me thinking about, all the things we interact with on a microorganism level. And for context for the audience, germs basically is a very broad term we use in science, and it basically just means any microorganism. Can be viruses, can be bacteria, can be amoeba, protists, all that stuff. But it's anything that basically you can't see with the naked eye and could potentially get inside of you and cause damage. It could just be getting sick. It could be a lifelong illness. It could be death. So the panel doesn't know this, but I kind of fell down the rabbit hole a little bit with this, and I started looking up random facts about germs. So I double-checked a lot of these. I'm just going to share a couple with how much you interact with germs and all the things you probably didn't know. So here's some statistics about germs to gross you out a little before we get into this. All right. Did you know that 62% of men and 42% of women do not wash their hands after using the toilet?
Oh.
Man, that's awful. We need to get better about that. That's disgusting. All right. You transfer more germs by shaking hands than you do by kissing.
I could see it.
Another one, 72% of shopping carts tested positive for fecal bacteria, while 50% tested positive for E. coli.
Oh.
So that means when you're at the grocery store, there's a 72% chance that you have some kind of fecal bacteria on your carts. That's what that means. All right, and I'll share one last one. During an hour's swimming in a public pool, you will ingest 1/12 liter of urine.
I do not believe that one.
I double checked that, so I don't know. I don't know how they measure the exact quantity, but yes, you will ingest some urine by swimming. Is the big
If you're
takeaway.
drinking the pool water,
I mean,
which I don't think
small
most
small
people
children might
drink
be,
the
professional
pool
swimmers
water.
might be. But yes, germs are all around us, and with this article and everything, I wanted to kind of talk about our experience with germs and our comfort level with germs now that we've gone through a pandemic, and how all of that has kind of influenced how we interact with everything in our daily lives. So I'm just going to pose a general question. What is your comfort level with germs?
I tend to be a big weirdo when I'm cooking. I will wash my hands and the cutting board over and over, and then I'll think to myself as I'm cooking the chicken and it's browning, and I say, well, when I add the vegetables, I'm going to use the spatula again, but it's been touching the raw chicken, and has it gotten hot enough? And my brain just keeps going. So sometimes I'm very paranoid about it, and then other times I just don't care.
I think none of those things you said really surprised me that much, because I have internalized the fact that, every part of your body is just covered with bacteria, and, you don't ever want to think about the amount of bacteria that is on and in your body right now. And I think I kind of accept that, and I'm like, I'm gonna throw it all in the pan and get it pretty hot, and most of the time, it'll probably be fine. I'm not known for my strict adherence to FDA food safety guidelines. I'll say that.
But my bacteria, those are my homies. They live with me.
Yes.
What about you, Eunice?
So I would say, after the pandemic, my comfort level has become I'm slightly less comfortable when I'm exposed to public setting, or if I go into public and I touch some surfaces. And I think it's a good thing. One good thing I would say that the pandemic has taught us to be generally aware of germs and their repercussion of touching spaces or touching surfaces in a public area. So whenever I go outside and I touch surfaces, where elevator buttons or anything, I am conscious until I get back home, or I see a restroom. Until I wash my hands, I'm kind of conscious of the fact that I need to go and wash my hands. So yeah, I think this is something which happened usually before the pandemic. I used to wash hands before eating, after toilet and stuff like that. But I have personally noted this change in myself, and I think it is a positive. I would call it a positive change.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I am kind of like Sebastian, where I accept that there's germs everywhere, but I always, wash my hands after the restroom and then before I eat food and stuff. But in general, I feel like I don't really think about it that much. I'm just kind of unless I get sick, but I'm usually all right, who got me sick? Who had the thing that they gave to me that I interacted with at a social event? So I think more about it in that context. I don't always think about it in the context of surfaces I'm touching and what I'm touching with my face with. I remember if you remember way at the beginning of the pandemic when everyone was like, don't touch your face, don't rub your eye, don't scratch your nose. I was like, and that was before we knew everything was transferred more in the air, but we were kind of freaking out because it was just what are you touching? How are you touching yourself? How are you touching surfaces? All that stuff. But yeah, I feel like the pandemic kind of made me think about it a little more, but now that we're all mostly vaccinated, I imagine, and assuming you got a vaccine at this point, I don't really think about it. I'm kind of just yeah, whatever, which sounds kind of not callous, a little more cavalier than it should. I should, be more conscious of this now that we just lived through this. I don't know. What do you all think?
I'll say I'm there as well, as far as COVID is here forever, basically. It's a permanent fixture of being around other people, just like the flu season was. And, I'll say I don't want to spend the rest of my life wearing a mask. And, with the fact that vaccination has dramatically reduced the fatality and, the true severe impacts of what everybody has to deal with, once again, I'll wear a mask if going into like a crowded place, somewhere that is high risk. But other than that, I also take the opinion of every germ is a different level of dangerous to every different person. Like your immune system does an amazing job, and for most of us, almost everyone, a majority of people can completely take for granted like what germs there are in the world, and what things are dangerous, because our immune systems take care of everything for us, and they normally do a great job. And I think it's really people with weakened immune systems, people who don't have the immunity or who have like specific struggles with that. It's for them, even things that would not infect, any normal kind of immune system, you can be susceptible to a lot more diseases just by not having that immunity. So there are people out there who truly do have to be worried about everything. But I am fortunate and lucky that I am not one of those people.
I do like post-pandemic, pre-pandemic Western society, we weren't big mask wearers, I would say. And now I see people, if they've tested negative for COVID, but they have a cold or some kind of upper respiratory system, they wear a mask. If I'm on mass transportation, it is much more socially acceptable to wear a mask. If I'm going to be around someone I know who is immunocompromised, I can wear a mask. And I really appreciate those changes. I couldn't tell you the last time I had a cold since pandemic started. So I think there's been some good response, some practical changes to prevent germ transmission.
Yeah, I agree on that. It feels like wearing the mask is more or less socially acceptable. Like if we did it pre-pandemic, people would be like, why are you wearing that? Like that's kind of weird. Unless you're in like more of an Asian culture where that's kind of a standard practice. If you're, even if you have a tickle in your throat, you put it on, just be polite and make sure you don't spread everything. But now it's like, okay, we had this cataclysmic event go on, biologically speaking. And now it's like, okay, like masks are normal. Like we want to protect ourselves. When people see it, people don't freak out and like, why are you wearing that? It's just like, okay, it's just a courtesy. I agree with Becky. I really like that aspect.
Yeah, but how would you feel about like in the post-pandemic era, if somebody tries to like say impose a mask on you? And I'm asking this because last week I was in San Francisco and I went into a bookstore, and the bookstore, the person who was working there, he gave me a mask, and I was like, can I ask, like, why is there a particular reason? Because, like, the CDC guidelines and everything, like, we don't necessarily have to wear a mask. And then he told me, the question was more for, like, educational purposes. I was trying to understand his reasoning. And he said, like, one of his colleagues, who was, like, a 40-year-old lady, she died of COVID. And then, like, in other situations, maybe I would have slightly talked to him more about this, like especially if somebody asks you to put a mask on. But since like it involved his grief or his loss, then I said, okay, I don't have any problem with that. So what do you guys think, like if you go somewhere and people ask you to, hey, you have to wear a mask?
I don't mind. I just, for whatever reason, I never have. I'd be fine putting it on.
I think, if it wasn't a huge burden, I think there's activities where wearing a mask is particularly horrible, and if it's just walking around in a store, I think at this stage in the pandemic, I personally find it a little silly to wear masks just in everyday life. That's just my personal value judgment based on the fact that the greatest amount of risk has passed, and where we're at now is probably how it's going to be forever. So if there was ever a time to stop wearing masks, it would be now. But once again, in private businesses, of course, they can require whatever you want. A lot of people failed to understand that in the beginning of the pandemic, that a private company can demand that you wear a mask to enter their property, and it's not like, I don't know, illegal to do that. But
Yeah, I agree with that part totally.
What about you, Jeremy?
It wouldn't bother me. I think just because I've had to wear it so much, I get it as a courtesy. Again, I don't know the person's story, the people who own the shop or whatever, they might be immunocompromised. Maybe they just don't want to get sick. I get it. I mean, minor inconvenience, like, all right, fine, I'll put on the mask. But again, it's not that big of a deal, 'cause most likely I'm not going to be in the store for, hours on end. I'll be there for like 20, 30 minutes. As an interesting side anecdote, I have an individual who goes to the UMSL gym every morning when I'm there, and I don't know if he's immunocompromised or just very germophobic, but he is mask. He brings his own towel. He has his own pairs of gloves. He has wipes that he wipes. And naturally, you should do this anyway for the gym equipment. Wipe it down, after you use it. But he must wipe the equipment down both before and after he uses it with like 5 or 6 of those like Clorox wipes. So he's like very germophobic. On the one hand, I'm like, this is very excessive. Why are you doing this? But on the other hand, I'm like, I don't know this guy's story. So I try to think about that whenever I see other people wearing masks, even at this point in the pandemic.
if someone were to like ask me to run a marathon in a mask, I might argue a little bit. But as far as any normal use case scenarios, once again, if it's their business, they can ask that.
So now that, since we kind of discussed the ideas of masks and now we don't wear them as much as before, and this is not just COVID, this is just collectively exposure to germs, how much exposure do you think we should be having to germs in general? Obviously, we had some when we grew up and probably ate dirt. I mean, I ate dirt. I don't know if you guys ate dirt. But
Yeah.
It tastes good.
But is there a good level of exposure? Is there a nice sweet spot where we're exposing ourselves to some things but not everything?
Ooh, you've set us up to discuss the hygiene hypothesis.
Oh, please elaborate, because I don't know what this is.
There's this idea in immunology that there's an optimum amount of germ or pathogen exposure to essentially keep your immune system busy. And if you're in a very sterile environment, you are more likely to develop autoimmune problems. So it's this idea that, yes, there is an optimal level of germ exposure to make sure that your immune system doesn't start attacking yourself. And don't ask me the molecular backup for that, because I won't be able to explain
I was going to
it.
ask the logistical of like how many days a week do I have to expose myself?
This is also related and directly related to allergies and things like peanut allergies, which we've noticed a strong increase in the frequency of peanut allergies, and due to the fact that your immune system is what causes your defense against bacteria, but when it attacks the wrong thing, that's an allergy. It's basically just your body attacks parts in the peanut because it thinks that they are a disease. And you can see the increase in these allergies as people stop exposing their kids to things like peanuts as a child. So that's one of the problems we're seeing, is by totally depriving ourselves of all these things, we're actually getting worse reactions, and our bodies are starting to attack the wrong things.
Okay. Another question I had was that we talk about the hygiene hypothesis. Now, in terms of exposing ourselves to germs, should we, as a society as a whole, be exposing ourselves to germs? Is the idea of we expose ourselves for our immune systems, but what about collectively? Should we be all exposing ourselves, or should be the idea of trying to not transmit things?
I guess it depends on the thing and the likelihood of complications. Like, vaccines are the safe way to do that, right? So I think it just depends.
I'd put this to let's not expose ourselves to any new diseases. I think there are plenty of them circulating around that I won't say it's good to get, but if you are regularly, like if you occasionally get the flu, you are less likely to die of it if you live somewhere that has no exposure for 10 or 20 years or whatever. If you are regularly exposed to low levels of something, you will be much better off against it. Once again, that is the principle behind vaccination, but also just the principle behind, general circulating diseases. But I think that the thing we really need to avoid, and the reason why this pandemic was bad, is that diseases are way worse when they just begin. Like, as soon as a new disease emerges, that is when they are the most deadly, and, that is when, the Spanish flu was when the flu basically came into being. Like, every flu season since then has just been a continuation from the, 1918 Spanish flu, and for the next 100 years, everybody will be getting the coronavirus, strain that's derived from the one, we just saw emerge a couple years ago. But every year that goes by, or okay, I don't want to say everyone, occasionally things get worse, but after the initial spike, the death rates go way down because people have prior exposure. So, once again, slow exposure to the things that are already out there is all right, but new diseases are really bad.
Yeah, so I would say, it would be interesting to know what scientific literature says about it. Because speaking of exposing ourselves to germs and everything, do we mean like injecting ourselves with the germs or like consuming them in any way? But again, then like how do we decide? Because every person's immune system is different and every person is different basically. So how do we decide, and how do we decide the amount of it? And in the first place, like, do we need to really like expose ourselves to germs? So I don't know what the scientific literature would say about it, because I think that would be the safe way to go about it.
Yeah, I think what Sebastian and Becky brought up earlier, about the vaccines being the most efficient way for, those terrible diseases like COVID, and I don't have a good example of other vaccines I could think of. Measles, mumps, rubella. Other flus.
Chickenpox would be a good one. Before the chickenpox vaccine,
people
would do chickenpox parties, which I would not recommend. You can get very serious complications from chickenpox.
Did you guys get chickenpox as a kid? I got chickenpox as a kid.
I got it twice.
Oh my God, you can do that?
Yeah, kind of rarely, but I guess it can happen.
Okay. Interesting. I did not know you could have a second one, or do it a second time. Yeah, I wish we had vaccines for chickenpox, because that sucked back in the day. Very itchy. All right. One last thing as we wrap up the show. With germs and our germ exposure and all of that, do you think there are misconceptions we have collectively as a society about germs and germ exposure? Not just us, the scientists, the people everywhere.
I would say, like, growing up, I used to think, and most of the kids might think, I would say, that germs are just like negative things that just, cause damage to our body and stuff. But if you look, they have like our positive role in our bodies as well. They help like fight a lot of diseases, and they help break down of the food that we eat and stuff like that. So I think that is one of the major misconception that comes to mind. Secondly, I would say, like, from a personal experience, we think as if germ exist only in dirty places, like toilets and stuff like that. But they're everywhere. There are trillions of germs in different shapes and forms on our bodies and inside our bodies. So I think these are the two misconceptions that I can think of.
Yeah, I agree with Eunice. That's well summed up.
I think one thing that the pandemic kind of brought out is how hard it is to understand probability, and like what a 2% like likelihood of death means. And I think, that's what COVID was for a long time, and a lot of people are like, that's really low. I don't have to worry about that. And in one way, you're like, okay, sure, maybe 2 out of 100. But if 1 out of every 50 people who went to Walmart got shot, no one would go to Walmart. And it's that kind of math that people are it's really easy to dismiss it when you're like, 2%, that's low. Except when your entire country gets it, that's like several million people that would, hypothetically die in that situation.
And it wasn't hypothetical.
It was not hypothetical at all.
Yeah, that's the whole mentality, I think, for me, is when it's not happening to you, it's just a statistic on a piece of paper. It doesn't really matter. And then when it happens to you, it matters all the world.
We're very bad at that in general, just as people, but that's how it goes.
But like Becky said, the courtesy now that we wear masks and it's now normal, it gives me hope for sort of that courtesy, I guess, worldwide, even if we don't statistically, or if the average person does not statistically understand, like, X percent equals X number of deaths, even if it's not in my backyard, even if it's another country, like, the population of another country is huge. I don't remember the exact number, but how many people actually died from COVID, like, worldwide? I thought it was, like, several million.
I don't know worldwide, but in America, 1 million, more than 1 million Americans died from the pandemic.
Okay. And then, yeah, someone quickly Google how many people have died in COVID worldwide. You're looking up the numbers?
Oh, yeah, they don't have the little counters anymore, which is
Yeah.
kind of
Do
telling.
you remember back in the day when we used to, like, refresh the page and it would tell how many cases we had and how many deaths?
According to World Health Organization, it's 6.8 million, approximately.
Okay.
Yes, this is what I'm getting here on this website too.
Yep. 7 million people is quite a lot. Even
It's a huge number.
yeah.
It's basically like a city, like a large city that just
Yeah.
got wiped off the face of the earth, which is crazy.
Yeah, I think, people don't really think about germs, up until the pandemic started. Like, it's definitely a societal reckoning with contagious disease. And I think the acknowledgement that if you're sick, you shouldn't come to work is something that, like, I don't know, kind of work culture didn't acknowledge very much beforehand. Like, I think, I feel like people would go to school and go to work and whatever if they had the flu, and just, like, I don't know, to avoid missing that day, and that's kind of the thinking that makes it worse for everybody overall.
Oh, yeah. I went to work when the swine flu was a thing because I thought I couldn't call in. And now
Yeah.
that wouldn't be a thing.
And it's kind of crazy, like the number of people who died by COVID, like if we collect all the viruses, they were like maybe they can make like a teaspoon or something. I was reading somewhere, and I was like, this is crazy. Like, how can we imagine that? But this is real, So not all the things that are smaller on microscopic level, they're innocent. They can be like vicious too.
Well said. And that is going to wrap up this week's episode of That Science and Nature Show. Thank you so much for listening. I want to thank Becky. I want to thank Sebastian. I want to thank Eunice. And like we've said before, I want to thank you, the listener, for tuning in this week and listening to our show. We will be back next week to talk more science on That Science and Nature Show. Until then, my name is Jeremy Howard, and we are out.